Where do you turn in times of great distress? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Letton. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. Today, I'm going to continue my series, The Buddhist Path in Fiction, Stephen King edition, and today I'm going to be talking about the novel Revival. I want to start by saying, and I'm probably going to say this at the beginning of every video because people may not watch all these videos in order, and it's kind of important to say, is that I am not making any claims that the author believes any of these things. I am going to be looking for different Buddhist philosophical or soteriological ideas in the text, but I don't think these are the beliefs of the author. In fact, the author will have themes that they want to explore, and they may overlap or coincide or be concordant with these ideas, but what I'm trying to do is not find out the specific meaning that the author was putting into this text, but instead I'm trying to model an example of what I like to call intimate reading, where I bring my full self to the text. In my case, that means over 2 decades worth of Buddhist contemplation and study and meditation. And by bringing my full self to the text, what I am hopefully doing is finding something in the text that gives me an opportunity to learn something new about myself and about the world around me. So these are different ideas that emerge for me as I read the text. And it may be a similar idea to a theme or a concept that the author is playing with, or it might be something as simple as I read a certain line of dialogue or a certain line of narration, and that sparks a separate thought or a jumping off point for me, that it makes me think of something. Or at the very least, even if I don't find anything in the text, I always have how I experience the text, which is to say that I can look at if there's a character or an action that causes me to be frustrated or causes me joy, or if I have any sort of emotional reaction to the text, that's an opportunity to examine where did that emotion come from? What was it about this character statement or this action or this bit of narration that caused me to feel a certain way? And so there's always an opportunity for me to explore myself within the text. So I'm not making any claims about what the author means in the text. I don't think that the author is putting any of these Buddhist ideas in the text intentionally. That is not my claim. But this is me bringing my full self to the text as a way of modeling intimate reading. With that said, up front, the video will have kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be a summary or a brief discussion of the specific Buddhist idea that I wanted to highlight with this book. The second part will be a quick summary of the book, and there will be spoilers. I won't give any unnecessary spoilers. So things that don't need to be spoiled, I won't spoil. But you can expect the ending of the book at least to be spoiled. And then lastly, the kind of most important part of the video is the analysis. So once I have laid out some different Buddhist ideas that I want to think about, and I've given you a summary of the book, then I'll actually go into the book. Maybe I'll pull out some quotes or just some different passages and look at how that relates to these different Buddhist ideas and what came up for me as I was reading the book. As always, there are timestamps down in the description, so feel free to jump ahead to whatever section you want to jump to. As I mentioned in my introduction video, I wanted to structure these videos and these discussions around a series of Buddhist philosophical ideas or topics for meditation that are constructed in a specific sequence that we're taught as a way to encourage our deeper understanding and our meditation practice. And so I chose a book that hopefully has something to say about the specific topic that I brought up. Sometimes it's a stretch, sometimes it's going to fit perfectly. We're going to see how it goes. Now, the Buddhist philosophical idea that I want to talk about using this novel is refuge, or refuge in the 3 jewels. And so what do we mean by refuge? If you just think of the worldly sense of refuge, what do we mean? We mean safety, somewhere we go for safety or for protection. And so here, refuge in a spiritual sense means the same thing. It means spiritual protection, spiritual safety, the source of safety and protection from suffering. Now, refuge is an important concept because in Buddhism, when you actually generate a genuine mind of refuge, that is what demarcates you as a Buddhist. And it doesn't have to do with titles. It doesn't have to do with you calling yourself a Buddhist or other people calling you a Buddhist. But what demarcates someone from being a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist, at least in terms of action, is having a genuine mind of refuge. Now, a genuine mind of refuge is a mind that recognizes that the 3 jewels of refuge are authentic sources of refuge. So the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But a mind recognizes those 3 are authentic sources of refuge, and importantly, there is no authentic source of refuge outside of the 3 jewels. That is what it means to have a mind of actual refuge. So for spiritual refuge, what we're doing is when we experience the suffering of the world, we are looking to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha as our protection from that suffering and as our way to be free from suffering. And that is why the previous video I discussed the suffering of the lower realms. That was the topic, the philosophical topic that I was exploring. And the reason that is taught right before Refuge is because developing a genuine fear of the suffering of the lower realms is one of the primary causes for actually developing a mind of refuge. When you recognize the type of suffering you're experiencing and the type of suffering you may experience in the future if you don't engage in proper virtuous action, then that compels you to seek out protection, and that genuine protection is going to be found in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the reason this is important to think about is because we, in our lives, we search for refuge all the time, but we look towards worldly things as if they're going to protect us. And we don't do this explicitly, but it happens all the time. Think of if you've had a difficult day and you're stressed out, what is the first thing you do? Maybe you sit on the couch with a bowl of ice cream and turn on a movie because you think this is going to save me. This is going to make me happy. I'm distressed. I'm unhappy. What do I turn to find happiness, to find freedom from this anxiety? And it's a worldly thing quite often. Right? Think of all the moments in your life when you experience distress or grief or loss or pain or explicit suffering or any sort of stress or anxiety. Where do you turn to find relief from that? And odds are it is a worldly phenomena. And we grab that worldly phenomena with two hands and say, this is going to somehow protect me and save me. And now, worldly refuges are never going to save you from samsara, from suffering, because they are themselves included within samsara. So samsara is the continual cycle of birth and death, the continual cycle of suffering that we are trying to be free from, and we're trying to free all sentient beings from this continuous cycle. That's what samsara is. And if something exists within samsara, is contained within samsara, how can it free you from samsara? So we say that all types of gods or supernatural beings or any other worldly phenomena is a worldly refuge. It can't free you from samsara because they themselves are trapped in samsara. Yet we spend so much of our time looking towards worldly things as if they're going to save us, as if they are genuine sources of refuge. That is the problem. And as long as we grab onto them thinking they are actual salvation, then they're going to cause us more suffering. That's the difficulty. Yeah, there can be sometimes short-term benefits, right? And sometimes we need those short-term benefits depending on our circumstances and our mental or emotional states. We need, help. And worldly sources of benefit or worldly sources of protection can help us in the short term, but they're never long-term solutions. They're never actual refuge, okay? All they are is like Band-Aids. And sometimes we need Band-Aids, but we have to recognize this is a Band-Aid. It's not going to heal my wound. It's only a temporary measure. And so when we teach about refuge, we say, examine your actions, examine when you are feeling distressed, and ask yourself, where do I turn when I'm distressed? What do I grab onto as if it were refuge? And is that really serving me in the long run? Now, again, I said refuge, taking a genuine mind of refuge, is how we are demarcated as Buddhists, quote unquote, in action. You can also be a Buddhist. You're understood to be a Buddhist in terms of view, which is to say you accept the four seals. All compounded phenomena are impermanent. All contaminated phenomena are suffering. And by contaminated, we mean anything that is concurrent with afflicted minds. All phenomena are empty and selfless, and freedom from sorrow or nirvana is actual peace. So those are the four seals. If you adopt those wholeheartedly, that means you are a Buddhist in terms of view. But to be Buddhist in terms of action, you have to have a genuine mind of refuge that recognizes that the triple gem, the three jewels, the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel, are the only authentic sources of refuge, the only way to be free from suffering. So what do we mean by those three? The Buddha jewel is the founder. He was born a prince, and he showed the aspect of being human, and then realizing that his princely or royal life was not going to be a life free from sorrow. And so then he turned to the other extreme of practicing extreme asceticism and hardship. And then he eventually realized that also was not going to lead to liberation. So he practiced a middle view, and he engaged in deep meditation, and he realized the nature of reality. And when he did, he began to teach it. And that is what's called the Dharma jewel. So it's important for people who aren't Buddhists to recognize that the Buddha did not invent Buddhism. He merely discovered the nature of reality, and then he taught it. And what he taught is called the Dharma jewel. And then the Sangha jewel are the collection of practitioners, of people who have achieved insights or realizations. So advanced practitioners who then can help guide us on the path. We use the term Dharma quite a lot. Dharma comes from the Sanskrit word dhar, which means to carry or to uphold. So something that is upheld is a Dharma. So in this case, when I say the Dharma jewel, I mean the teachings of the Buddha. Also, sometimes we say the Buddha Dharma. But anything can be a Dharma, any philosophical system. is a dharma. So you can say there is Christian dharma, there is Hindu dharma, Jewish dharma, Muslim dharma, there's worldly dharma. The law is a type of dharma. So the term dharma is used a lot. Here, what we mean is the teachings of the Buddha. And of those three, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, all of them are authentic sources of refuge, but the actual refuge is the Dharma jewel. That is the nature of reality itself and the teachings that explain the nature of reality. Because the Buddhas, they can't free us from suffering. They can't give us their insights or their realizations. All they can do is teach us the path to free ourselves from suffering. The analogy that's often used is the Buddha is described as the great physician, right? So he diagnoses our illness. He says, this is why you're suffering. This is the cause of your suffering. And then he prescribes medicine. And the medicine he prescribes is the Dharma jewel. That is the medicine that is actually going to alleviate our distress. And then the Sangha jewel are the nurses who teach us how to take the medicine, and they make sure we're following the proper regimen. Okay, so we have the physician, the medicine, and the nurses. And of those three, the medicine is what actually cures our illness. So that's how we think about the three jewels, which are the authentic sources of refuge. And now the reason I thought Revival would be a good novel to discuss refuge is because the main distress in the novel comes from a character seeking out worldly refuge as if it is going to provide him actual protection or safety from his experiences of grief and suffering. So what is Revival about? Revival is a 2014 novel written by Stephen King. It is one of his newer novels, and many people will say that it's slow and that it's all building up to the ending, and the ending is the only good part. And I highly disagree with that. I will say that the first 2/3 are really devoted to character, and they build up character depth, and they create an emotional resonance with the character, and they create a sense of dread and atmosphere, and they're necessary because the last third is crazy, and it does go off the rails, but it doesn't have any sort of emotional impact if you don't care about these characters. And King does a great job throughout the first 2/3 of really making you feel for these characters. Both the main character is who's a man named Jamie, and then this reverend, this preacher named Charles Jacobs, who he meets. And those are the two characters that this story swirls around. Now, the story is told in the first person from Jamie's point of view, and he is telling you about his life. So the very, very end of the story is him in the present day and what he's doing right now in the present day. But the whole rest of the story, the other 98% of it, is him in the first person narrating his remembrance of his life, starting in 1962 when he's 6, which is the first time he meets Reverend Jacobs. And Reverend Jacobs has come to their small town in Maine to be the new reverend of their Methodist church. And that's when he meets him. And he develops a really strong fondness for Reverend Jacobs, and everyone does. Everyone loves the new reverend. He's young, he's hip, he's got a beautiful wife, he's got a really great young son, and everyone in the community loves him. He's a good preacher, but he also knows how to connect to the kids, so everyone there is on board with Reverend Jacobs. Then 3 years later, there is a great tragedy. There's a car accident, and his wife Patsy and his son Maury are tragically killed in this car accident, and it breaks him. Right? It totally breaks Reverend Jacobs. It shatters his faith, not just in God or Christianity, but in humanity in general. And he preaches what's called the terrible sermon. And why they let him preach, who knows? But a month after the accident, he preaches the terrible sermon. And that is what kind of cements Jamie in breaking from the faith. At this point, he was only 9 years old, but he breaks from Christian faith in general as a result of this terrible sermon. And it is a pivot point in his life. And so then there's a jump forward in time. We see Jamie as a young man. He's become a musician, a guitarist, and he is touring the country, and he also has a drug problem. He has a heroin addiction that is disabling him, basically. And in the middle of this addiction, he again meets up with Reverend Jacobs, who's no longer a reverend, but he is instead working at state fairs doing these electricity shows, because now he's always been obsessed with electricity. Even when he was preaching, he had this obsession with electricity. He would tinker, he would build things, and he would use electricity and the power of electricity, and he's especially overwhelmed by the power of lightning as a representation of God's great strength. And he just thinks electricity itself is fascinating. So he has been tinkering with it, and he discover what he calls special electricity or secret electricity. And now Jamie meets him, and he is doing state fair circuit, basically doing carny shows where he is using this secret electricity to take magical photos of people, basically. And he's putting on a sideshow, and he's using it to earn money so he can continue his investigations and his research. When he meets Jamie, he says, "Look, I can help you." And he brings Jamie to his laboratory, and he uses the special electricity that he has been harnessing to basically cure Jamie. He cures him of his addiction as well as an injury that he had from riding a motorcycle and falling off a motorcycle. So he cures him of his ailments. And so Jamie is very grateful, but also wary, because this isn't the Reverend he knew. This Reverend is bitter, and he is a showman, and he still has that caring, compassionate heart of the Reverend he knew, but it isn't the same person. But then they go their separate ways again. And then you flash forward again to sometime in the future. At this point, Jamie is a sound engineer. He lives like a pretty chill life. Sometimes he gets to play music as like a member of a session band, but in general, he's recording music. He's living in this world of music, which is important to him, and he's got like a decent amount of contentment in his life. And then he meets the Reverend again. And now at this point, the Reverend is taking on the persona of a faith healer. And he is putting on these big tent revivals around the country where he heals people. And Jamie goes to one of them. He actually is healing people. People who are paralyzed, people who have all sorts of physical disabilities. He's healing them using electricity, but claiming it is the power of God, right? And so all he's doing is putting on a show to continue finding money to fund his research. You realize he has become incredibly bitter. He doesn't believe anything to do with religion, but he thinks that all these people that believe in religion are dupes and that he can just take their money from them and use it as a way to continue his research. And why is he doing this research? It's because he is convinced that this secret electricity will allow him to pierce the veil between life and death. And he needs to find proof that his wife and his son, who were taken from him so tragically so many years ago, they still exist, whether it be in heaven or in some higher realm of existence, that they still exist in some way. And he's convinced that he can harness this secret electricity to do that. But of course, as you can imagine, things don't go to plan. Okay, and that's how things get crazy. And he recruits Jamie to help him in his investigations after he meets him as a revival preacher. And Jamie doesn't like the man he's become, but he feels indebted to him for having saved his life. And so the back half of the book, that final third of the book, is Jamie helping him continue his investigations, trying to use secret electricity to pierce the veil between life and death. And that's where it gets these very cosmic overtones, and the type of horror is like overwhelming in the last third of the book. And so I'll leave it there. I won't the actual ending of the book. I won't spoil, but it doesn't go to plan, as you can imagine. I think what's really interesting about this book in general is that, Stephen King doesn't like bullies. His antagonists and the worst people in his novels are bullies. You can tell he just doesn't like bullies, and for that reason, some of the main antagonists across his oeuvre are either police officers or religious people, and that's because he sees that people have power, whether it be worldly power in the case of police officers or politicians, or spiritual power in the case of people that represent organized religion, and then they use that power to harm others. He kind of sees that as the ultimate bully. And so often some of his greatest antagonists are either people that are wielding spiritual power in the form of being believers or members of organized religion, or worldly power in being politicians or police officers. And now he doesn't always hate on them. I mean, From a Buick 8 is a wonderful depiction of a police department, and Father Callahan from Salem's Lot is a really incredible depiction of a man of faith. So he doesn't always rail on them, but he does dislike bullies and hypocrisy and the way power corrupts people. And so in the character of Reverend Jacobs, you have this depiction of a man who is incredibly devout and incredibly well loved and was a pillar of the community, but he undergoes this tragic experience, and his faith isn't strong enough to overcome that. And as a result, he turns into a bully. He turns into the kind of person that uses power to put others down. And so King shows this evolution of how spiritual authority can corrupt you, especially if it isn't based in actual belief, in actual conviction, but in some worldly aspiration instead. That's the novel. I think it's wonderful. It is slow for the first 2/3 of it, but that is because King is doing a really meticulous job of developing the relationship between Jamie and Reverend Jacobs. He's doing a really good job of telling you who these characters are and creating layers of emotional depth between these characters' journeys. And since it is told in the first person, you have this real intimate portrayal of Jamie's experience. Even though it's him remembering it as an older man, when he's talking about what it's like to be a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old who is, the youngest in a family of 5 kids and who is finding safety or finding comfort with this new reverend, it's this genuine sense of appreciation and childlike wonder at this new person who came into his life, who respected him, who treated him like a friend. And so I think the slow parts, quote unquote, slow parts of the novel are incredibly important because they're what make the last part work. If you don't care about the characters, if you don't see the characters go through this journey of having happiness, of losing it, and then where do you go when you lose it? How do you bring yourself up? How do you come out of the throes of addiction? How do you deal with losing your wife and your son? If you don't see how those tragic events rearrange the characters' identities and create something new, then the ending isn't impactful, or it isn't as impactful. So that is the novel. And so now I want to talk about a few instances in the novel where the idea of refuge comes up, or something comes up that allows me to ruminate or contemplate refuge. And then after that, I'll talk about a few things in general that came up as well. But I think in general, it's worth looking at and saying, what does Reverend Jacobs actually take refuge in? And, if you're a Christian, then you take refuge in the teachings of the Christian church, right? In God, in the Holy Trinity, let's say. And at least in the beginning, he seems to think he takes refuge in that, and he does express faith. But you can see in the time of his struggle, in the time of his grief, then he loses his faith. And that just suggests that his actual refuge doesn't have any firm grounding, And there's even foreshadowing in the beginning. There's a moment where someone mentions to him something being lucky, and the Reverend says, coincidence and lucky break are words that people with little faith use to describe the will of God. And so he's saying, look, you have to accept everything in life as the will of God. And yet, when tragedy strikes, he isn't able to do that. And this is something you see in every faith tradition, is how you turn to that faith in times of difficulty versus in times of excess and joy. And ideally, you should be returning to them the same amount, right? So if you believe in God, then you are saying that all of the great things in your life come from that, and you should celebrate it. And by doing so, by creating that confidence, then in times of distress, you already have built up the foundation of belief, of faith, of protection, of refuge. And that's not what happens. Often we take it for granted when things are going well, and we only turn to our spiritual tradition when things are going poorly. But at that point, when you're facing immense grief, immense loss, you don't have the tools to grab onto that faith in a meaningful way, right? Because you haven't done the work, and you only want it when you need it, not all of the time. And that is even what the Reverend is saying in the beginning, that when things go well, that's the will of God. And yet he himself isn't able to accept the will of God when things go poorly. And of course, in this case, by poorly, we mean a horrific car accident that brutally takes the life of his young wife and son, but still, he doesn't have the resources. And so what does he turn to for refuge? He doesn't turn to his faith. He turns to his grief. He turns to his grief and his sadness and his anger at God. And that's what he takes refuge in. And his worldly belief that his understanding, his knowledge, his intellect can prove something beyond what that faith tradition taught him that he doesn't feel is sufficient. So he turns to these worldly refuges as if they're going to save him, and all they do is lead him deeper and deeper into more sorrow, more anger, more frustration, and in the end, greater suffering. In his terrible sermon, the terrible sermon is a great monologue. Mike Flanagan is famous for making a number of Stephen King movies, adapting the novels into movies, and he's also famous for, in his other work, such as the Fall of the House of Usher, in The Haunting of Hill House, in Midnight Mass. He's big on long monologues, and I can just see him doing a film version of Revival, and a 10-minute one-take monologue of this terrible sermon. I can picture it in my head. But in the terrible sermon, Reverend Jacob says, religion is supposed to be our comfort when the hard times come. That's true. But that's only true if you've done the work when the hard times aren't there. That's the important part that he's missing. And it goes the same in Buddhist theory, is that if you don't do the work now, when you have favorable conditions, how do you expect to have any basis to be content or to be free from suffering when you actually experience more explicit difficulties, right? You need to do the work now. We need to tame our minds now when we have the opportunity. And to some extent, that means going for refuge, understanding what it means to rely upon the Dharma as the way to be free from suffering, and to rely upon the practices that are taught to develop our minds, to tame our minds, to develop control of our emotional response to the world, to understand what it means to live in samsara. We have to do that now when we have favorable conditions. If you wait until things are hard, it's almost impossible to find genuine refuge, to find genuine salvation, if you want to say that, because your circumstances are too overwhelming. So the Reverend is right when he says that religion is supposed to comfort us in our time of need, but it only works if we do the work now. That's such an important part of any spiritual journey, but especially in Buddhism. We say, we've been suffering for so long and we haven't paid attention to it. We need to start paying attention to our suffering and to the truth that our suffering and our happiness both come from our own mind and from our own afflictions and from our own realizations, our own practice. And by developing that, then we're able to have the resources, the tools to deal with trauma, stress, grief, anxiety when difficult circumstances arise. There's another great moment when the Reverend is talking about lightning, and he says, "The sight of those storm clouds rolling in makes a person feel very small. And when a person is beset by worries or doubts, feeling small is not such a bad thing." I think this is a perfect encapsulation of what proper refuge really means. Proper refuge is realizing that we need to find sources of safety outside of ourselves. And the way we do that is by looking towards the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? By looking towards the Triple Gem and realizing that the teacher and the community of practitioners are there to show us how to engage the Dharma, how to understand the nature of reality, how to practice in such a way that will free us from suffering. But we have to realize how small we are. We have to realize how limited our own experience is. And so sometimes that feeling of being small is very helpful because it provides you the motivation to realize the scale of reality. And that then gives you a chance to analyze your place in the world and how your mind determines your place in the world. But if you don't have that sense of scale, then you instead have an ego that says, I'm bigger than everything else, then it's very hard, right, to see through that. So feeling small is not such a bad thing. I think it's a wonderful sentiment. Now, another case where you see them turning towards worldly refuge is Jamie as he becomes a musician. He says talent, because he has like a preternatural talent for guitar right from the beginning. It doesn't take him a lot of effort. He says talent, like certain addictive drugs, it comes as a friend long before you realize it's a tyrant. Here, I'm thinking of Jamie turning towards his talent and his skill as a musician as a type of worldly refuge. He even says later, music is everything. He says, playing filled the hole in me. It was its own thing, an emotional truth. Playing made me feel like a real person again, right? So he is looking towards music and his performance of music, his artistry, as if that were salvation. And it did provide him some relief, some temporary relief, but it's worldly relief. Right? It didn't actually solve his greater emotional problems. It didn't solve his experience of suffering. It gave him a temporary relief. But since he grabbed onto it as if it were ultimate relief, and that talent, that skill, that music, that artistry, it wasn't ultimate or genuine protection, then what happened is when it was taken away from him, then he developed greater and greater addiction to drugs, and then everything spiraled out of control, because he was relying on a worldly thing as if it were going to give him an otherworldly result. Another thing I found particularly interesting, if we're thinking about refuge, is how much of our experience of refuge comes from it being modeled and performed by other spiritual leaders. And when the Reverend is taking on the persona of a revival tent healer, he puts on this great performance, right? And he says, I turned my face from God then, and I cursed him in my heart. I wandered in the wilderness. He tells this whole story, and for him, it's a show, it's a performance. But for the people that actually have faith, the people that are there, especially the people that are hurt and they want some sort of healing, salvation, that are putting their sense of refuge in him as a healer and as a conduit to God, for them, it's genuine. But for him, it's all a performance, it's a sham. So Jamie is in the audience at one of these revival meetings, and it makes him sick. He finds it offensive, right? Yet that same act is inspiring to those who are seekers, to those who have faith. And so the idea of refuge is a slippery one, because to some extent we bring our own baggage into our experience, right? And so one person can be engaging in a certain action, and when I view it, I see it as offensive. And when someone else views it, they see it as inspiring. And that has to do with our relation to our own understanding of the nature of reality, and it has to do with what preconceptions we bring to the world. What the Reverend is saying in that scene, that in our grief we wander away from our refuge, that is true for most of us, right? And now he goes on to use that to exploit people that are needy, to exploit them and say, if you've wandered from your refuge like me, then you have to find me as your salvation, because I found salvation. I can give it to you. So he is using that as a way to exploit people. But his sentiment is true, that when we experience great tragedy or grief, whether it be physical illness or loss, we often turn away from whatever had been grounding us, right? And that just shows that our sense of refuge isn't strong enough. Which isn't a criticism, which isn't blaming us, but it's recognizing why now, when we aren't experiencing that grief, it is critical that we find something to ground us. We find something to protect us, to give us some sort of relief, even in times of plenty, in times of joy. Because when those times disappear and we have to face something difficult, we need to have that. And if we haven't built up the muscle now, then it's not going to help us in the future. You see the Reverend's heel turn as he's talking to Jamie, and Jamie is kind of, really critiquing him for the way he's exploiting people and saying it isn't fair that you exploit people this way because they're desperate and they're needy, and what you're doing is mean. You don't believe anything you're saying, and you know that you have this weird magic electricity that's healing them, that it's not God. What are you doing, So Jamie is disgusted by it. And as Jamie is reflecting on the way these people are being taken advantage of, he says, here they were, falling for a story that made Santa and the Tooth Fairy look like gritty realism. He was feeding them shit and they were loving it. And I had the dismaying idea that he was loving it too. And that was worse. The Reverend has taken refuge in his grief to such an extent that it's made him bitter. And therefore, anyone that actually has any sort of faith becomes anathema to him. And so he is using their faith and their desperation to exploit them, not just because he needs money, which he does for his research, but because he is so angry at faith because the faith didn't do what he needed it to do. It didn't give him the freedom from sorrow and grief that he wanted it to give him. Because of that, he is so bitter and angry towards it that anyone that actually has faith, even if it is just a needy, desperate faith that is looking for their own safety or their own freedom from physical disability, even if that's the only faith they have, he sees them with that faith and it angers him. So he is happy to exploit them. He thinks so poorly of them because they're finding some sort of faith in this thing that he has given up. And that is all due to him turning towards worldly refuge, the refuge of his sorrow, his grief, his anger, as if that is going to save him. Because in times of desperation, worldly refuges look really appealing. They look like they're going to fix our problems. And that's true for all these people as well who go to these revival tents, right? That they see someone who says, I can heal you. And it doesn't matter what the Bible says about charlatans, about people exploiting the teachings of Jesus. What matters is they see someone who says he can heal them, and they've been suffering for so long that they're desperate. And so turning to a worldly refuge seems like a good decision at this point. Desperation makes you make poor choices, basically, which is, again, why you need to develop a sense of refuge, a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of spiritual practice, a sense of spiritual strength, of protection, when times are good. You can't wait until you're desperate. The Reverend even says, they don't deserve the truth, and that's okay because they don't want it. They don't want the Beatitudes of the Song of Solomon either. They only want to be healed. He doesn't mind exploiting them because he says that their faith isn't genuine anyway. They don't really want salvation. They want temporary happiness only. So it's okay to exploit them. So you can see how this worldly refuge has really perverted the Reverend's sense of being and has turned him into a monster, basically. And his obsession with this secret lightning and the potential for it to pierce the veil between life and death, that he might see his wife and son again, it has perverted him from a holy man, a man of faith, a man of the community who everyone looks up to this monster who is wearing the robes of or putting on the performance of a holy man only to exploit people and abuse them for his own ends. And that's what happens when you turn towards worldly things and expect them to give you otherworldly results. Okay, so those are some of the places that I saw the idea of refuge come up across this novel. There weren't that many, actually. I think it's more of a general vibe that you see the Reverend taking refuge in worldly things because he loses his faith. And so for me, that is the reminder that we need to develop a sense of refuge, but also just a sense of any sort of spiritual practice. And again, at least if I'm speaking in a pluralistic way, right, not just about Buddhism, I think it's critical we develop the resources to navigate grief, trauma, suffering when we are doing well, right? When we are in good conditions, we have to build up our emotional and spiritual resources, whatever they may be. Even if you're a humanist or you don't have any belief in any spiritual tradition, you still understand that you need to have some sort of emotional resources that when times get difficult, you have something available to you to turn to, right? And so as a Buddhist, I would say that that is refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, and that is an understanding of your own mind. A Christian would say that is belief in Christ and in the Trinity, right? So different spiritual traditions will have different things that you turn to. But what's critical is in the time of plenty, in the time of joy, that is when you build up your resources. That is when you develop a plan, basically, and you develop confidence in yourself as someone who can practice that plan. And now, if you're a person of faith, then you also realize that you have to turn towards that source of safety, that source of refuge, in the good times as well as the bad times. If you want there to be a sense of safety and protection and help in the bad times, then you also have to give that same power. You have to give yourself up to that same power, rather, in the good times as well, right? It's not only when you need it. It has to be all the time. So that vibe kind of pervades this novel, which is why I really thought of this novel. The specific instances are really just expressions of that. But that isn't to say there aren't other things in this novel that got me thinking. There are a whole number of different ideas. So these are just some general things that popped out at me as opportunities for contemplation, for philosophical inquiry, just for things to think about. You know, right in the beginning, when Jamie is young, he's 6 and he is talking about sharing his toys with his friends, and he's angry that his friends get to play with his toys as well. And his mother says to him that it's mind business is half the trouble with the world, Jamie. People have many ways to be lousy to one another, and you'll find out about that when you're older. But I think all that bad behavior stems from plain old selfishness. And this cuts to the heart of a lot of Buddhist doctrine, that we say all of our suffering comes from our self-cherishing mind. All of our suffering comes from the belief that my happiness is more important than your happiness. That causes my suffering, not just your suffering, but my belief that I'm more important than you. That causes me to suffer, right? It causes me to develop an ego that puts me at the center of the world, and that is never something that can be satisfied in any meaningful way. So all I'm doing is constantly setting myself up for failure and for greater and greater suffering. Self-cherishing, the mind of self-cherishing, is the mind that causes all of our suffering. That itself comes from ignorance, right? From misunderstanding of how we exist in the world. But that selfishness, that is the cause of all the problems in the world. And King nails it right there. You know, the wisdom of a small town mother right there nails all that bad behavior stems from plain old selfishness. It's that easy. Another moment that gave me a little bit of pause, the Reverend is explaining electricity and the power of electricity to the young children. And he says, knowing how something works and knowing what it is are two very different things. And he's talking about lightning and the, impossible powers that it has. But for me, I really think it shows us how it's easy to understand something superficially and understand all the different parts of it. But really knowing it, having insight into it, understanding it is much more difficult, right? So knowledge and wisdom are two different things. And so in Buddhism, I can say I have an analytical knowledge of what causes my suffering, and what causes all of our suffering. But having that knowledge and having the wisdom to actually realize it, to not have doubts about it, and to see how I can circumvent it are two different things. So we need to start with knowledge, right? But then that has to develop into an experiential wisdom. In Buddhism, we often say that Tusam Gomsum. So when you're engaging in any new topic of study or spiritual practice, there are 3 steps to it. The first is study, right? Of learning something new. And then there's contemplation. So when you are engaging in a new topic, whether it be a soteriological topic or a philosophical topic or anything, once you learn that new thing, then you contemplate it, you analyze it, you say, do I really believe this? Does this make sense to me? Here are my doubts. How can I get rid of those doubts? What are the answers to them? So you do that analytical work of contemplation. And then once you've developed some certainty, then you meditate on it. That's the third part. So study, contemplation, and meditation are these 3 critical roles that we play in engaging new material if we want to develop wisdom. If we want to not just understand something intellectually, but have an experiential wisdom that has insight into that thing, we have to go through these 3 phases. And so the difference between knowing a thing and knowing how that thing works, I think, is a really interesting site for contemplation. And it can guide us into how we engage in everything in the world, not just spiritual endeavors. If you want to go into worldly endeavors, it's critical to both first have an understanding of the thing, and then going through all of your doubts and contemplating it to try to understand it from every side, from every angle. And then once you have that intellectual understanding, then you try to take the intellectual understanding and transform it into a type of wisdom, into an experiential understanding. The importance of having that experiential understanding or that wisdom is then we engage in reality from that wisdom. We don't have to constantly be second guessing ourselves. There's a part later in the novel where Jamie says, "This is how we bring about our own damnation, by ignoring that voice that begs us to stop." If you don't have the wisdom that understands something, then even if you have the intellectual understanding, you say, "I know this is bad for me, but I'm going to do it anyway," because you don't have that experience that says how bad it really is for you, whatever it may be. Okay. And we all have had that experience, right? That you know something, you're going to regret it later, but you do it anyway. And that's the difference between understanding something analytically and having insight or wisdom into that thing, right? Knowing something and knowing about a thing, that's the difference. And we can see it all the time in our lives. At least I can. I can think of so many examples where I know if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to regret it tomorrow. And yet the immediate thrill, the immediate worldly pleasure that I think I'm going to get from that causes me to do it anyway. There's another small little insight that I appreciate. The Reverend has this diorama that he built, and it shows Jesus walking on water. But obviously, it's a parlor trick, right? There's like a small track, and the water is very shallow, but it's painted in a certain way to make it look deep. And he uses it as like a study aid to impress the children. But, in the beginning, when Jamie realizes that it's a trick, he's explaining it to him. And the Reverend says, "I muse on that sometimes, how just a little bit of paint can make shallow water seem deep." What this got me thinking of is deception is easy, yes, but it also means that we have the power to reach people if we know the right methods. Just this idea that all it takes is a small amount of paint to cause the appearance of something to totally change. And by changing that appearance, you change the way that that thing is engaged, that way that thing that is understood, at least from a distance. Small changes can have big effects, right? That's something I think about quite a lot. That it doesn't take a huge transformation in the way we engage in reality if we want to have the huge result of being free from suffering. Okay? It doesn't take us to become a monk and move to India, right? That is an extreme example. You can make small changes in your life that have outsized impacts. So sometimes it's just a small cone of paint that causes shallow water to appear deep. Sometimes you just need to understand something in the right way, have it presented to you in the right way. That small little change can unlock great insight. Even if that small little change is hiding something, is done in such a way to be skillful, to bring you to a deeper insight. There's another moment that jumped out at me that is just King sharing some of his kind of old-timey folk wisdom, following a real graphic depiction of the car accident and of what happened to Patsy, which is really awful, just physically. Her suffering and what happened to her in this car accident was really bad. And he says that the Reverend is musing on how her beautiful face was ripped away from her in a second, right? Her beauty was disintegrated on the asphalt in just a moment. And then after that reflection, King just adds, "It's fragile beauty," which is just King, again, being folksy, right? Bringing like the old time front porch wisdom. But the fragility of beauty is what makes us appreciate it, right? The beauty that is easy, that is long lasting, doesn't have any real impact, right? Because it becomes status quo. But actual beauty is fragile, and that is what makes it precious to us. And so it just got me thinking of what it means to appreciate something. We only appreciate those things that can be taken away from us quite often. We don't appreciate the things that we have developed confidence in, or we don't appreciate them until they've been taken away from us. We don't appreciate them when we have them. We wait until their fragile nature shows its face and we lose them. Then we regret not having appreciated them more when we had them, because it's fragile. Beauty is. One of our earlier videos in this series was about death and impermanence, and King gives a great reflection on death and impermanence when Jamie is thinking about the Reverend having lost his wife and his son, and he just says, that morning he had awakened next to his wife. He had eaten breakfast next to his son. They talked about stuff like people do. We never know. Any day could be the day we go down, and you never know, right? That is the heart of living in samsara. You never know when your time is up. You never know when you might die. And so why are you wasting this opportunity you have? right now. From a Buddhist perspective, we say, why are you not engaging in meaningful spiritual practice right now? Why are you not dedicating yourself to helping other sentient beings, to bringing joy to others, to bring others freedom from suffering? Why are you not doing that right now? Because there's no guarantee that you'll live until tomorrow, right? So why are you putting off engaging in virtuous activity? You have to do it now. And the way you are compelled to do that is by meditating on death and impermanence and on the fragility of your life and on the fact that you could die at any time. And so this line just really highlights that. We never know. And that's something, again, that's easy to understand intellectually, but it's hard to understand experientially. As I was saying before, the difference between intellectual knowledge and experiential wisdom, there's a wide gulf between those two things, right? Knowing that I could die at any moment. Of course, we all know that. That's easy to understand intellectually. But actually having an experience that there's no guarantee that I'm going to live until tomorrow, that I'll wake up from sleep tomorrow morning, that experiential wisdom propels you to act in such a way that you are making the most of every moment of your life, that you're not taking anything for granted. When they're contemplating the death of his son and his wife, someone says, people always want a reason for the bad things in life. Sometimes there ain't one. You know, there's a whole field in Christian theology called theodicy, which is basically, why does evil exist in the face of an all-powerful and all-good God? That is what theodicy is dealing with. So why do bad things happen to good people, to put it in layman's terms? The term theodicy was coined by a German philosopher in the early 18th century. And there's all sorts of apologetics explaining it. And, you know, most of them are not very convincing to me. I took a whole class on theodicy when I was in grad school. Most of them don't, actually not most, none of them are convincing to me in any way. But for Christians, maybe there are some convincing arguments. Buddhism has its own understanding, which is essentially karma. But in short, if we want to say that there is no reason for that bad things happen for no reason, then that leads to a sense of nihilism. And that is almost always destructive. Or it can lead to destructive behavior, that sense of nihilism. And you see that with the Reverend. When he loses his faith and he says that there is no answer as to why bad things happen, the path that leads him down is one of anger and bitterness and destruction, both self-destruction and destruction of others as well. There is a great moment when Jamie is in the throes of his addiction and a clerk at the motel, I don't know, she either takes his possessions. I don't really remember the circumstances, but he's angry and he looks at her and he says, "This is such bullshit." And she goes, honey, this is reality." I think that's so great. I think that is, again, King just like cutting to the truth of the matter, saying that the way we experience things is due to so many causes and conditions, so much of our baggage, that we are ignoring or denying reality, and we are so puffed up with our own idea of how things should be, of our own egos, that we are denying the truth of the situation, right? So in that moment, the character is a drug addict who is experiencing the consequences of his behavior, which is that he is engaging in really self-destructive behavior that no one else wants to be around, because he's causing problems for all of his bandmates, for everyone around him, because of the self-destructive behavior. And then when people act accordingly in response to that, he gets upset. We're so used to identifying ourselves as the victims and denying the actual reality of the situation. Honey, this is just reality. The problem is, the real danger of that is, if we spend our whole life denying the nature of reality, denying the reality of the situation, we aren't only losing our ability to navigate difficult times, but we're robbing ourselves of joy. We're robbing ourselves of the joy that comes from living in this world, right? Even though we say that we are living in samsara, we also believe that there is worldly joy and worldly happiness that we can experience. And we don't look at that worldly happiness as if it was the end all be all. We don't grab onto it with both hands and say, we deserve this, we expect it, but we do experience it. And the only way to be fully present in those moments of joy is to be dealing with reality, not with our own bullshit, right? Another line that jumped out: after Jamie is cured of his addiction, he's offered heroin again, and he doesn't have any desire or instinct to take it. And he says, after a heavy meal, a banana split is not an object of desire, but it's just an object. And the truth is, that is something I think about all the time, right? That we teach that the way we engage in things around us are due to our misperceptions of reality, right? A banana split is not an object of desire when you're full. But when you're hungry, all of a sudden, that is the source of your joy. That is the source of your happiness, because you look outside of yourself for happiness, for joy, for fulfillment. You look at these external objects as if they were real happiness, and you grab onto them and you think, this is going to make me happy. But all it gives you is the fleeting taste of happiness, not genuine happiness. And the reason you know that to be true is because that same object doesn't give you happiness when you're full. One of my teachers would often say that if chocolate cake was happiness, then the more chocolate cake you ate, the happier you would be. But you know that after a certain period, that same chocolate cake is only going to be causing you distress. It's going to be causing you suffering. So obviously, these external things cannot be genuine happiness, because if they were actual happiness, actual joy, then the more you consume them, the happier you would be, because our capacity for happiness is infinite, right? But this just shows that happiness comes from inside. It doesn't come from outside. A banana split is only a cause for happiness when you're hungry, not when you're full. And that means that it is not an object of desire. It is not something you need. It is your relationship to that thing that's important, right? The happiness doesn't come from anything without. It comes from within. And as long as we are placing our expectations of happiness on external phenomena, we're never going to be truly happy. Later, part of the reason that Jamie agrees to help the Reverend in his experiments is he's so angry at him for having lied to so many people that he wants to, expose him and hold him to account. And he says someone needs to call him to account for what he's done. So he has this motivation, this like righteous indignation. And I can appreciate that motivation. But then you have to ask, where does that urge bring us? The urge for revenge, the urge to say we are better than someone else, even if that person does engage in harmful things, right? That person is harming others. But then that mind that says, well, I'm clearly better than them. Where is the end result of that? How is that beneficial? When has the instinct to cause harm ever resulted in long-term happiness for yourself or others? And the answer is never. Okay? It might give some temporary relief, some temporary happiness, but that instinct to enact revenge, that instinct to put someone down, it's not an instinct of compassion. At least our base instinct isn't. We might say that I'm doing this because I care about others, and therefore that's the reason I am taking this person down. But that's not the case usually. It's mixed, right? Yes, we care about others, but we also have our own pride, our own ego, and we care about showing that person that they don't deserve to do what they're doing, that we're better than them. So there's always anger or hatred mixed in with our sense of outrage. And that's why anger itself is never beneficial. It's always destructive. There's no such thing, according to Buddhism, of righteous anger. Anger only brings about suffering. Now, I would argue that there is such thing as outrage being an extension of compassion, which is to say that we don't want others to suffer. We want to relieve the suffering of other sentient beings. So when we see injustice or suffering being enacted or caused to other beings, we feel this outrage that wants us to relieve them of their suffering. I think that can exist apart from anger. But our problem is we usually mix it with anger, and our outrage and our anger mingle, and we think they're the same thing. And so we engage in harmful actions that are actually based in anger, not in righteous outrage. And as a result of that, we cause more suffering for ourselves and for others. So this belief that someone needs to call him out, where is the end result of that? Like, where does that road lead? As the Reverend's investigation and his research continues, the tools he needs are much less. So in the end, the final scene, the way he's able to manipulate this electricity, the tools he uses are like quite small. But when he first met Jamie the first time and he cured him of his addiction, he had this like big headpiece and all this equipment. And he says, and so Jamie is surprised, right? That like, where's all the equipment? And all you need is these like small things. And he says, as one progresses towards one's ultimate goal, support requirements tend to shrink. And what that made me think of is, the deeper our practice gets, the less external support we need. As it is right now, as beginners who are just learning what it means to lead a meaningful life, we need all the help we can get. And that means using any external things to our benefit. So for instance, when the teachings on how to develop a calm mind, a mind of calm abiding, we call it, shamatha, the instruction is, for someone who is just learning how to develop this mind, you have to abandon your homeland and you have to find an isolated place where you're free from all distraction. And in that place, you can develop a mind of calm abiding, a mind of shamatha. Now, once you've already developed that mind, you could be in the middle of the busiest marketplace in the busiest city in the world and have single-pointed concentration without any effort exactly on any object that you desire. But that requires you to have done the work first. You need the external support of being in an isolated place, of being in a place that's free from noise, free from the distractions of your loved ones or your enemies, free from all of those kind of external obstacles. So you need the external support of that isolation to then do your practice. But as your practice gets stronger, as your experience is developed, then you don't need that as much. If you look at a lot of Tibetan Buddhist rituals, a lot of the rituals, you'll see us ringing bells and holding different ritual elements and drums and all these different kind of ritual aspects of faith performances. And those are useful because our minds are so scattered that we use external paraphernalia to help realign our minds, right? Our inner experience. But as your practice develops, you don't need those things anymore. The closer you get to the ultimate goal, the deeper you practice, the better understanding you have, then the less accoutrement you need because you have all the tools you need on the inside. One of the overarching kind of ideas I got from this novel as well is you see Jacobs lashing out at people, Reverend Jacobs. Out of his grief and out of his sorrow, he lashes out at everyone. He lashes out at people of faith. He lashes out at the people that try to help him. He is just angry at everyone. And we can very easily say that hurt people, right? That he is experiencing grief and suffering in a very explicit way. And the only way he knows how to navigate that is by hurting others. That he wants others to share in his pain. Or at the very best, he's indifferent to their pain. Because hurt people hurt people. We develop habits and cycles of abuse and of violence. Emotional and physical violence. And what that makes me think of is what Buddhism says is our real enemy. There is no external enemy that is of any real significance. The real enemy is the internal enemy. The real enemy is the self-cherishing mind. It is the mind that says you are more important than others. That's the real enemy. And until you defeat the internal enemy of the self-cherishing mind, then you'll never be free from external enemies. As long as you're lashing outwards, there'll just be more enemies lining up behind them. They're never going to go away until you vanquish the internal enemy. That is what is critical. And the internal enemy is the mind that says, my happiness is more important than your happiness. Until you're able to override that, to defeat that mind, and not let that mind infiltrate and stain all of your actions, which it usually does, whether we realize it or not. Until you're able to defeat that enemy, you'll have external enemies for days. They'll never go away. You can defeat as many external enemies as you want. You can lash out and with great vitriol and attack anyone you want. There'll never be an end to external enemies as long as you haven't vanquished the inner enemy. And Jacobs is a great display of that. He hasn't done any inner work. He's only looking outside of himself. And so, he's always suffering. I think the last thing I want to bring up to wrap up this already long video is there's a quote near the end where he says, curiosity is a terrible thing, but it's human. So human. For me, an important part of my practice is remembering that I'm doing the best I can, that I'm living in samsara, which is difficult, and that my practice isn't going to be perfect. And I have to be able to have some grace for myself to realize that I'm doing work on myself. I'm doing the inner work. I am pointed in the right direction. I'm doing my best to be of service to others, and I don't succeed 100% every day. And I do take shortcuts, and I do sometimes, indulge my ego or my self-cherishing mind. But I do my best not to. I'm not a perfected being yet. I'm not a Buddha. I am a suffering, sentient being who's doing the best they can. Curiosity is a terrible thing, but it's a human thing. It is so human. All of these afflicted minds are very human things because we've created these patterns of suffering based in ignorance, as well as desire and anger, for so many lifetimes over and over again, that is our natural mode of being. And it takes a lot of effort to rebel against that, to try to find something more meaningful in our life, right? So this doesn't give us an excuse to be bad people, but what it does is it gives us enough grace to realize that I'm not perfect yet. So as long as I'm doing my best And I recognize that there will be hiccups on the way, that I'm not always going to be perfect. And that's okay. Okay. That sometimes I need to look to worldly things to help my mind. And that even if I have genuine refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, and I realize that worldly objects and worldly phenomena can never be genuine refuge, I also can realize that sometimes when I'm overwhelmed, I can find temporary relief in those things. And that's okay. It may not be ultimate relief. It's not genuine freedom from suffering, but it is helping me realign my circumstances in such a way to give me the capacity, the strength, the fortitude to then move forward. So I have to be patient with myself, and I have to be patient with my mind and with others, because we're all humans. We're all doing the best we can do. And sometimes, some days, not too great, but that's okay. We have to have that sense of patience and of space and of grace that we can hold ourselves and others in. And with that, from that place, then we develop actual empathy, actual compassion, right? And from that, we develop a practice that is leading towards liberation, even if it isn't going to be overnight. Okay, I think that is most of what I want to say about this novel. The novel deals with faith and with a loss of faith, and how external circumstances can cause faith to be corrupted. And then when that faith is corrupted, the power that you have been imbued because of your spiritual position can then become corrupting itself, right? And I think that is a really interesting thing to think about. So there's a lot more in this novel, just little tidbits that is peppered throughout that I think you can think about, you can ask questions about. However, this video has gone on long enough, so I think I've shared enough. I would love to know if you've read this novel, if you've enjoyed this novel, if any of the things I brought up, whether about refuge or anything else, are interesting to you. And so I would be very happy to have more conversations about this down in the comments below. I don't have a novel picked out for the next video yet. I am thinking of different options, so I can't tell you what that's going to be. Hopefully, it'll be within a month. We'll find out. But when I know, I will have it written down in the description, so you can check there. And the description also has links to all the other videos in this series, so I encourage you to check those out. I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of them down below in the comments, okay? But for now, I'll say thank you so much for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.